Um, Hi, I'm Philip Klein, editor of National Review Online. I just wanted to thank everybody for coming out tonight here on Capitol Hill, and I wanted to thank everybody for joining us online nationally, as I understand around the world. We're here obviously to talk about a very sober topic. This just wanted to, by way of introduction, introduce you to National Review Institute, which was founded to support the work of National Review, and as well as the ideas and principles on which the magazine was founded through supporting National Review, as well as educational programs and events like this one. And one of the other things that National Review Institute does is it sponsors our Buckley Writing Fellows, who are young journalists who come with us to help hone their craft early in their career. And one of those this year is Haley, who joined us last summer, and a few months after she joined us, October 7th happened, which was a very difficult and challenging story to cover with a lot of angles to it. And one of the storylines that Haley picked up on was the sexual violence that happened on October 7th, as well as the efforts to deny that the sexual violence had happened. And it struck me when I was following the story closely, that what's interesting is when you look at the Hamas enablers on the other side, they do a lot of things to try to justify the events on October 7th. They talk about oppressed versus oppressor, about this is what resistance looked like, about we have to conceptualize everything with, in the context of the occupation and so forth. But in many cases, they'll justify the murder, even kidnapping along these lines. But there's no framework when you're talking about settler colonialism or any other of these sort of academic jargons that are used to sort of dehumanize the victims of October 7th. There's no way to actually justify rape within the confines of it being an action that sort of will help bring about the liberation of Palestinians. And so that's why the response has been to just deny it, pretend it never happened, claim it's just propaganda. So part of our job and what we hope to do in a small part with this event is to try to push back on that and to document what actually happened, and not allow those who are trying to be enablers of Hamas to get away with it. And so with that, I just want to turn things over to Haley to introduce our panel.
Thank you, Phil, and thank you all so much for being here. It's great to see so many friends of NR here, right here in this DC. So first off, I'm just going to give a little overview of what we'll be talking about, and then we'll get to our panelists. When Hamas barged into Israel on October 7th, the world watched on as 3,000 terrorists murdered, assaulted, maimed, mutilated, decapitated, raped, and burned innocent Israeli men, women, and children. The attack's utter brutality seemed to be the point. Charles Krauthammer once wrote about the women and children phenomenon. No matter how far society progresses, human instinct is still to protect the innocence of women and children above all else, to get women and children to the lifeboats first when the ship sinks. Hamas, unlike student protesters and other pro-Hamas activists would have you believe, is not interested in this aspect of humanity that the rest of the Western world seems to share. Or maybe Hamas understood this basic instinct a little too well enough to use it against the Jewish people on October 7th, to show just how little Israel thinks of Israel's citizens. Hamas's attack was particularly brutal to women and children. That much we knew for a fact on October 7th. Conveniently, terrorists broadcast their crimes for us, gleefully, on social media and Telegram, ripping mothers from their families, throwing a woman with bloody pants into the back of a Jeep, parading a naked Shani Luke around Gaza on the back of a pickup truck, stomping on her lifeless body, and raising rifles above their heads triumphantly. It was immediately clear, that Hamas assaulted women on October 7th. Yet, on October 8th, international women's organizations, including the United Nations, were silent. And not for a lack of opportunity either. That week, National Review asked a myriad of women's organizations for a statement on Hamas's attack, specifically regarding the reports that Israeli women and children were being abducted and murdered en masse. Those were undisputed facts. In other words, we asked, where are all the women? It wasn't until December that UN Women finally acknowledged Hamas's indiscriminate violence against women. Now, as Israel fights to prove to the world what Hamas did on October 7th, some organizations and media pundits are even denying that rape ever happened, now that we have evidence it did. Perhaps the most depraved part of this story is not how women's organizations remain silent about Israeli women, but how women's organizations have since used their voices to oppose Israel and exclusively support the women and children in Gaza. So, 5 months later, as international support for Israel's just war dwindles, we're here to ask a different question. Where were the women? We'd like to play a quick video from the Hadassah Foundation, just on their End the Silence campaign. So we're gonna get that going.
Hear me. I work at a rape crisis center at Hadassah Hospital in Israel. The sexual violence and terrorism committed by Hamas on October 7 is sheer barbarism. Some raped victims were found with their bodies severely mutilated and abused, some murdered mid-rape. The suffering from sexual violence can last for years, with victims often contemplating or dying by suicide. Please hear me, because those who were murdered cannot speak for themselves, and the survivors often don't want to. Now, let the world hear you. Help end the silence.
With that, I'd love to invite our panelists, please, to come on stage. Thank you. Well, hello, ladies. Today we are joined by Eliana Johnson, the editor-in-chief of the Washington Free Beacon, who I'm sure some of you know has recently exposed Harvard University's ex-president Claudine Gay's penchant for both plagiarism and anti-Semitism. That happened in December, so thank you, Eliana, and the Free Beacon. Eliana is also a former White House correspondent at Politico and also the former Washington editor at National Review. We also have with us today Bonnie Glick, former deputy administrator of the U.S. Agency for International Development, a former Foreign Service office in the U.S. Department of State, with overseas tours in both Ethiopia and Nicaragua, and domestic tours in the State Department, the National Security Council, and the U.S. mission to the United Nations. She's also a senior fellow at the Foundation for Defense and Democracy. Nani Baraha is the Director of Operations for the Public Interest Fellowship. She was previously Service Learning Coordinator for Brooklyn Heights Synagogue and Program Manager for Jewish Community Project Downtown in New York City. And finally, Elizabeth Cullen serves as the Director of Government Relations for the Women's Zionist Organization of America, Hadassah, acting as Chief Lobbyist and Government Affairs Advisor. She was formerly Associate Director for Health Policy with the Jewish Federations of North America and the Washington representative for the Network of Jewish Human Service Agencies. It also, I think, is important to note that while all of your professional resumes are just incredible, and we're so grateful to be joined by a panel of experts such as yourselves, you all didn't just watch October 7th as politically active Zionists, you also watched October 7th as mothers, which is a good lead off, I think, into the discussion we're going to be having, which is, I hope, one of heartfelt humanity here. So I want to start off just kind of by asking where you all were on the feminist movement before October 7th. And specifically, how October 7th might have changed your perception of feminism, or the feminist movement in general. I think we have one microphone. Thank you. If you all just wanted to go down the line, that'd be great. Is it on? Oh no. Thank you so much.
So on October 7th, I was and I continue to be an ardent progressive feminist. I worked my entire career with those principles in mind, starting in college as a women's studies major. So yes, October 7th and October 8th were particularly discouraging.
Sort of like to go, not really a group joiner or a label taker. So, well, I'm a career woman and I'm all for, women's empowerment and all of that. I think I don't like what the term feminism has come to describe. I was 14 in 1998, the year that Bill Clinton and the Lewinsky scandal kind of burst onto the national scene. And I remember being on the family vacation with my family. And the memorable thing I was in ninth grade, like a rising 10th grader, I think. And I remember the women who went to bat for Bill Clinton to say that this was okay. His having an affair with the White House intern, including his wife who stood by him. Hillary Clinton. So in many ways, I think what we saw on what we've seen in these women's organizations is nothing new. It's not a new phenomenon, but it's sort of also the reason that I have resisted like the embrace of the feminist label and joining up with women of the left-wing persuasion who define what that term means in public life. But I'm all for women and women being professional and having families at the same time, but I resist or do not want to embrace what that term has come to mean in our public life.
On October 7th, I think I would say that I was an ardent Zionist. I was on October 8th as well, probably a million times more so. And the Zionist movement has never discriminated between men and women. And so the question of feminism, Zionism doesn't define me, feminism doesn't define me, conservative doesn't define me. I'm kind of like a whole package. I'm a mom of boys, men. I'm a mother of men who knows that they live in a world where women lead and men lead as well. And I think the greatest form of leadership is recognizing who has great leadership potential, regardless of color, gender, sexual orientation, any of that, and always looking for the bright lights and not those who dim them.
I think before October 7th, I would have called myself a feminist if feminism is believing in equality and freedom for women. But I also, like Eliana, never felt myself to be part of a feminist movement. And I think especially today, feminist movements, modern feminist movement sort of seems confused about whether or not womanhood actually exists. And it does. So I think I had trouble with that. And then I also, as a mother of young children, have been thinking a lot about, as they age, how to correct for what I think is the overreach of the Me Too movement, which I think combined or grouped together regrettable decisions and actual sexual violence. And so I didn't want to be part of a women's movement that did that either, or feminist movement. And then on October 7th, we saw actual sexual violence. And I don't think that any global feminist movement has spoken about it in a way that makes it any club I want to join.
Thank you for that. Yeah, I think that gives us a nice frame of reference of where you all are. And there's an old saying, believe none of what you hear and only half of what you see, which, especially coming from a movement that taught us to believe all women, which whatever you think about that, There is something, what you can see tangibly, which I want to move to October 7th now on that point. What did we see on October 7th? The photos and videos that immediately came out of the attack. What struck them? What struck you about them?
Carnage. It was carnage. I mean, that's what we saw. I think we all saw it. And I think you both spoke about it. Bill spoke about it. He's written about it and spoken about it. Something I think that we all found hard to believe actually could happen to women and children sleeping in their beds at home, civilians.
We saw a pogrom, and none of us is old enough to have lived through pogroms against Jews in Eastern Europe at the turn of the last century. None of us here in this room is old enough to be a survivor of the Holocaust. But what we saw on October 7th was the reincarnation of the worst in humanity. And that inhumanity was directed not just against women, it was directed against men, it was directed against children, it was directed against the elderly, and it was directed against Jews. And that's what we saw on October 7th.
Yeah, this was just an extermination attempt against the Jewish state without regard to gender, age, anything of the sort. And at the same time, we almost immediately saw from the haters and bigots and critics of the Jewish state this attempted hair splitting that we did not see in many cases during the Me Too movement, which were questions about, well, was rape, was it a war tactic of Hamas, or was it just incidental? Was it just done by civilians who cascaded through after? And it's really important to differentiate these two things. And were babies burned in their cribs, or were they just burned because the house was burned? And it's really important to distinguish these two things. And it's just really important to get the facts straight here. And I think that was something that really struck me when what was clear was that we saw with our eyes there, a woman carried in a Jeep with blood all over her genital area. And for anyone with two eyes, like you know what happened to her. And during the Me Too movement, there were women who were believed on their say-so. And I actually don't believe all women. Women should be held to the same standards of believability as anybody else. Like, we are capable of proving our case just as much as anybody else's. But that was challenged. Like, could you prove what happened? And that was something that really stayed with me and struck me.
So I think what went through my head on that day and in the days after really was that this was sexual violence used as a weapon of war and pure sadism and sexual torture, just real evil. The likes of which I hadn't, certainly not as graphically and in the moment, seen ever before.
That's right. And witnessing everything you all said, carnage, torture, just the worst violence on October 7th, on that date, not after anything had been proven, was quite something. And Elizabeth, you might be well poised to speak to this question, but I'd like to hear all of your thoughts. How should women's organizations have responded to this attack once they saw exactly what was happening, exactly what you all just described, and how did they respond?
So we heard almost nothing. I did a little research for today and, now came out with a statement. I don't believe it mentioned much about sexual violence. Later on, it came out with a statement about sexual violence that never mentioned Hamas, didn't mention Israeli women. As was alluded to earlier, UN women stayed silent for nearly 2 months. And this is not the usual pattern. If you look back, there was a 27-year-old who was beaten and murdered in Pakistan, and UN responded in a day. In Ukraine, UN women responded in a few days and then proceeded with an entire report and numerous statements. And they have the power, like they have the power to make statements and write blogs. And what I learned as somebody newer to the international law scene was that the condemnation by the UN and UN women was really necessary sort of procedurally with UN. And so it was extremely important that they say something, not just for public opinion, but as a matter of process.
I share those views. I would just add that I think there's not anything new here necessarily, in that we saw this during the Clinton impeachment scandal, and that there was a rallying of the feminist troops around President Clinton at the time. We've seen it again. We saw the crumbling, the dissolution of the, I'm blanking on the name of the group, Time's Up, Time Up or Time's Up, when the feminist, Democrat, professional cadre of women who founded it were shown to be aiding and abetting New York Governor Andrew Cuomo, who was accused and forced to resign because he sexually harassed women in his employ. And these women who had made their careers as Democrat feminists were consulting him and shown to have been helping him orchestrate how to smear his female accusers on the down low. That was happening. And so it was completely unsurprising to me that the accounts of Israeli women who said that they were raped by Hamas were challenged by the mainstream media, because I think what we've seen over the past 30, 40 years is that the testimonies of women of one perceived political stripe are given more credence and a higher level of importance than the testimony of women of another political stripe. And the left will go to great pains, in fact, to cover up, smear, discredit, and harm women on the right who are speaking up to talk about the harm that they've engaged, that they've suffered at the hands of the left, terrorists, whatever it is. And that for me is why, like, I cannot call myself a feminist. I see these people who are calling themselves that, who are cheered by the feminist movement, and the hypocrisy is stunning.
I think too, Eliana, one of the things that was probably most jarring was the massive rape, gang raping of women, possibly men as well, who attended that Supernova Festival in the concert in the desert, the peace concert. These would be those exact left of center, peace-loving, kind-hearted young people, idealists, from whom everything was stripped physically and emotionally. And I think that the fact that women's organizations can look, and really honestly leadership sleep at night, knowing that young women who were at a concert celebrating how they can sleep at night when they don't question what happened to those women. And how something like that could possibly have occurred. And I hope they don't sleep at night really ever again, because they don't deserve a good night's sleep. They have betrayed all women instead of believing all women.
I think just to add to that, what they haven't done, what they've never done, and what I want them, I wish UN Women or what any women's organization would do is to talk endlessly about the female hostages in Gaza right now. There are 14 of them who are, God willing, still alive, though we don't know. And I want them to be humanized, and I want their names to be said every time this conflict is spoken about. Naama Levy is the girl, the 19-year-old girl who was seen with blood-soaked pants and her heel slit being dragged from the back of the Jeep to the backseat of the Jeep. And I want them to talk about her, and I want them to talk about Shiri Bibas, who was abducted with her infant baby and her toddler, she's 32 years old. And Noah Argamani was the girl who I think she's sort of the face of people recognized. She was put between two terrorists on a motorcycle that she's seen reaching for her boyfriend desperately. And Romy Gonen, I want them to talk about Romy Gonen. She's 23 years old, and she was at the Supernova Music Festival. And she was on the phone with her mother for hours, actually, before she's abducted. And when her mother realized that this was probably the last time she was ever going to speak to her daughter, she started recording the call, actually, and she started saying things to her like, "You are not alone. I am with you. You are not alone. I am with you." And I wish that these women's organizations would say something similar.
That's just, yeah, that's chilling. And to your point, we didn't immediately know the names of the faces that we saw on October 7th on those videos that Hamas filmed themselves. Again, like I mentioned before, we didn't immediately know their names, but their names very quickly started to come out. The woman I mentioned before, Shani Luke, the German-Israeli citizen, was known as a German-Israeli citizen for quite some time, partially because they hoped that Germany would help get her out of this hostage situation. We thought she was alive. She ended up being dead. Cruelly lied to her mother, right? And said she might be alive in this hospital and gave her false hope. But there was another report that came out just today, Nani, and if you could touch on it a little bit, from the New York Times.
Amit Susana, who was a hostage who came back in November, who came back to Israel. She's documented now talking about this sexual violence that she was forced to perform on her captor at gunpoint. So there's just absolute solid concrete evidence that this is happening right now.
Absolutely.
So Hadassah is the largest Jewish women's organization in the country. We have an international division, and we run and own the Hadassah hospitals in Jerusalem, which are the only American-owned hospitals. So we take kind of a broad interest in this, both from a U.S.-Israel relationship, from a healthcare provider relationship. We run a crisis center. And, one of the things as I listen to everybody commenting and to your question is, what should have happened, what could have happened in the women's rights community and in the international body community. And really the question to me is like, why not? Why was it different? And we haven't addressed that. So Hadassah recently was at the UN at the Commission on the Status of Women. And nearby we hosted a few speakers for our own event. And one of those was the founder of a French organization called We Are Not Weapons of War. Her name's Celine Bardet. And she's not Jewish. The organization's not Jewish. And she made the point when asked, why was it different? And she said, in her whole career in France, it's modern. She would hear friends and colleagues talk about anti-Semitism, but she didn't really know what it looked like. And then on October 8th, she said she knew what it looked like. This was anti-Semitism, the world community not coming together to condemn Hamas for these actions, to acknowledge that it occurred, when they would have done so for any other people.
Right. I'd love to get the rest of your thoughts on this as well, and how anti-Semitism played a role in the media response, especially. Because I think far from media organizations and women's organizations being silent, some of them absolutely did use their voices to question the rape claims, to not only question them, but flat out deny them. Places like the New York Times, which published an expose report just damning at previous evidence that had come out that these rape claims did not happen. The New York Times published an excellent report and immediately was faced with internal backlash. Immediately, its internal staff said this was not vetted thoroughly enough. When the author went back and re-interviewed every single person he had interviewed before in Israel, the New York Times ran another story, again confirming the rape claims. So if you can all talk to maybe how anti-Semitism has played a broader role in denying rape.
I don't actually think it's that complicated. I think what we've seen is there are classes of people who are allowed to be victims and where their victimhood is trumpeted, and classes of people who are not allowed to be victims. And in this case, we've seen the media on the front page every day of the New York Times and the Washington Post and the Wall Street Journal. We see stories about the pain and suffering of Palestinian women and children. That is an approved victim class, and Israelis are not an approved victim class. And as a result, the rape, the targeting of Israeli women will be challenged, will be held to a far higher level of scrutiny. Even in the story published today, it was amazing to read. More than one MD gynecologist interviewed confirming the claims of this woman. She was so traumatized that she would not speak to the details of what had happened because it was too painful to her to talk about. But the level of confirmation that was evident in that story was far beyond what you would read in a typical New York Times story. And it's clear that the Israeli women are not an approved victim class, and as a result, they will be held. The rape of Israeli women claims of that will be held to a far higher standard.
I think that's exactly correct. And I'm going to say the quiet thing out loud. If there is a hostage release and the Israeli women who are being held hostage are part of that release, many, if not all of them, will be pregnant. And it is that level of confirmation that's going to be made clear. But it's like that's the only thing that's going to get the world to accept that rape has been used as a war crime. And as awkward as it is to talk about it, it's something that is probably something we should all be talking about, because these women are being tortured. The men are being tortured. They've been held for 171 days in terrorists' homes and in civilian Gazan homes. These innocent civilians who are subjected to Israeli war crimes, according to the South Africans. These people are housing in horrible conditions Israeli and other nationality hostages, and it is truly a war crime what's happening to them, and we will be witness to that should, God willing, they be released immediately, unconditionally, all of them. But that's the quiet thing that nobody's talking about. And when you talk about rape as an act of war, there are consequences to a rape. And there are all kinds of societal and psychosocial impacts of that happening.
I think going back to the anti-Semitism in the media, I have been told many times never to read the comments section on an article about Israel. And it's really good advice, and I have really a lot of trouble following it. And so spend a lot of time in the comment section. And I think in addition to the reporting and the different categories that mainstream media has for Jews and non-Jews, Israelis, the comment section is the perfect example, I think, of anti-Semitism at play. And in addition to denial of all of these sexual violence, there's also sometimes celebration, and sometimes there's the response, what did you think resistance looks like, or resistance by any means necessary? So saying we have no choice, we can do anything, it's all part of our resistance, including rape.
Before we continue, I feel like we're just starting to scratch the surface, but our time will come to a close somewhat soon. You all have note cards on your chairs. If you have questions for our panelists, please write them down and we'll get to them in just a few questions.
Civilized, they don't even.
I know. For any of you crazies out there, yeah, we have note cards. But Eliana, I want to go back to something you mentioned, which for me was like one of the most egregious parts of the aftermath of October 7th and of rape claims. Which is what Israeli women must do to prove that this happened. And any victims, any hostages who were victims now have to come back home where their families were most likely slaughtered, where they have no more homes, and they have to go through a series of rigorous testing. Elizabeth, I know that Hadassah does a lot of work with the rape crisis centers, and there was recently a report published by the larger rape crisis center in Israel. Can you discuss that a little bit with us? And specifically, can you go through with us what women have to do to prove to the international community, to the UN, that they were in fact assaulted?
So I would say that, first of all, Special Representative Pramila Patton's report confirming what had happened, even with a few caveats she had in there, is a first step. And it's, completely bolstered, of course, by the Israeli Rape Crisis Center's report, which really goes into detail about what happened and precise actions that happened based on evidence in much more detail, frankly, than Special Representative Patton's report did. As far as what women have to prove, so one of the other speakers we featured at our March 12th event, and a woman I admire incredibly, she just won Israel's top humanitarian prize. It's Dr. Kohab Elkam-Levy, who is an international and human rights lawyer at Hebrew University, law professor. And she immediately started an effort from Israel to document what happened, because she recognized as an international human rights lawyer, when she saw the silence of the UN and she saw the silence of the international women's rights community, that Israel had to be the one to document this. And I would say too that, and I've heard Ambassador Scott say this several times, why did these denials happen? Why were they so prevalent immediately? And she talks a little bit about how with Holocaust denial, that took decades to develop. But in the era of social media, it took a matter of hours before these denials started to happen. So, the Civil Commission, where Dr. Kohab Elkam-Levy is working to document the war crimes against families, they're trying to interview witnesses, as with the rape crisis centers. They're trying to, look at forensic evidence. They're trying to verify with AI, with companies that, the video footage wasn't AI for the world. And it's, really disheartening. Not that disheartening that they have to go to this level of effort, but the reason they have to go to this level of effort, frankly, is that the UN is not doing an unbiased, independent investigation. And Special Representative Patton recommended in her report just recently released, that it be the Commission of Inquiry to do this investigation. And Hadassah's position is that that Commission of Inquiry is so biased, and that there have been numerous reports, you can Google them, about its bias. And the Biden administration recognized it along with 26 other countries, that this Commission of Inquiry is not the appropriate party to be conducting an investigation. They cannot be interviewing traumatized survivors and witnesses who would be absolutely fearful to have their words twisted in a way and not to be believed. And I just think that the volume of evidence is so, extraordinary. We have it. Why should there be this disbelief that the UN, what Hadassah is urging? We submitted a petition signed by 130,000 people from 118 countries. We submitted a letter signed by 117 organizations from US, Israel, France, urging the UN to conduct this unbiased, independent investigation. So I hope that between Civil Commission, the Rape Crisis Center report, reporting in the press, there's a role for Hadassah as an advocacy organization to help raise awareness. And I think there's a strong role in the press to raise awareness and amplify the facts. So thank you.
Just a separate brief point, but part of this conversation is part of the, I think, premise of the conversation is frustrating to me, because I sort of have to ask, like, we know that women and their babies were kidnapped and murdered. Like, do they have to be raped? Does sexual violence have to take place for women's rights organizations to be up in arms? That plenty of awful, horrible things happen to women. And again, it brings me back to this point about splitting hairs. Like, women and their babies were murdered in front of them, and the mothers were murdered in front of their babies. Like, the burden of proof to get the anger up in the women's rights organizations is maddening to me. Like, the stuff that played out, that Hamas videotaped and broadcast to the world, is bad enough. It should be bad enough for the women's rights organizations to be out front, pissed off about.
This kind of brings me to my last question before I get to all of your questions. But what can we do in each of your respective fields and in ours? There are very many politically active people here in the room. What can we do to raise global awareness? And what can international women's organizations do now, aside from call for the unconditional release of hostages with every breath they take?
I'll just start briefly. That's too big a question for me, but I do think pointing out the hollowness and shallowness and poverty of the organizations that claim to speak for women. I think it was very meaningful when Time's Up crumbled and the press was able to show through hard-hitting reporting that actually these women don't speak for women, and that other organizations are able to do reporting and shed light on what really happened. I think that's a real service.
There have been some really heroic members of Congress who, Jewish and Gentile, who have pushed back against the crazies who wander the halls of Congress on a professional basis. I'm talking about the Code Pink ladies and these other radical groups whose single purpose is to, in the case of October 7th, to lie, to demean survivors, and to distract attention from Hamas and their war crimes. And there have been some amazing members who have gone out on a limb. And I think part of what our responsibility as citizens is is to thank our members who do that, but also to hold accountable those members who refuse to do so. And that's something for those of us who are here in Washington, that's a fairly easy lift. For people who are online watching this, reach out to your representatives, call their offices and make sure they know how you feel about voting on aid packages for Israel. Israel has 3 goals. It needs to eliminate Hamas. It can't do that without ammunition. Tell your representatives to fund the ammunition that Israel needs to finish the job on Hamas. Israel needs to see all of the hostages released, living and dead. They want to reunite families and bring the hostages home. I love that there are people who say, bring them home. It's really Hamas's responsibility to release the hostages that they are holding in a criminal manner. And then lastly, Israel's 3rd war aim is to ensure that Hamas will never rise again. And that means that it has to be utterly destroyed. Tell your members that you support that and tell them that they have to support that too. Support Israel with aid in the form of munitions and whatever they need to end the war. Give them space, give them time to do it. It doesn't happen. They shouldn't be on a stopwatch. Give them and the hostages, as well as the victims, the courtesy of a bit of privacy and time to heal.
I concur completely with banker members, Senators Gillibrand and Ernst and Rosen have been amazing on this, as has Representative Wasserman Schultz and many others. As an advocacy organization, specifically in a humanitarian organization, we will continue our End the Silence campaign. We will continue to beat the drum. We will continue to demand action from the UN. There are creative solutions. There are things that the Secretary General could do, we believe, to ensure an unbiased investigation. So we'll continue the hard work that we've been doing and doing it in coalition with other organizations, including our partner Jewish women's organizations, but also organizations like We Are Not a Weapons of War, non-Jewish organizations. I think it's really important to build those partnerships, many of which are new, frankly, to keep the light on this issue.
Calling out the bias of the United Nations has, as I'm sure many of you know, been Bill Buckley's and was Bill Buckley's goal for many decades. So I'm grateful to hear you say that, and we here at NR are grateful to hear you say that. So now we have time for a few questions. The first one, Nani, I know you and I have talked about this a bit, so if you would feel comfortable answering this, that would be great. But how has October 7th, if at all, changed how you'll talk to your daughters or your granddaughters or your nieces about sexual violence or just about Israel and resilience?
Yeah, I don't know. That's the truth. I don't know how to talk to them about it. My daughters and my son, my husband is here. We talk about this endlessly, how to talk to them about it. Bonnie, you talked about this earlier, like I wasn't alive for a pogrom. I wasn't alive during the Holocaust. And so when people have spent their entire lives figuring out how to teach it, and what the message should be about living joyful Jewish lives today. And I don't know how to talk about something that's happening today with them.
Anyone else want to chime in?
A good friend's son was scheduled to get married on October 14th. And he got married, Jewish wedding, and everyone came because there was a need to show a little bit of defiance in the face of terror, but also that the Jewish spirit lives and cannot be extinguished. And I'm betting that lots of moms had misgivings about celebrating family joyful events, whether it's a baby naming or a bar or a bat mitzvah or a wedding. But I think the counsel that great rabbis give is you have to show joy and you have to experience joy, even in the face of this great darkness.
I don't really have a better formula, I think, than what my parents told me and advice for which I feel grateful, which is there's good and evil in the world and you will see it. And this is an example of it. And don't turn your back on Jewish people. There's a lot of attrition and don't be part of it.
So as the mother of two daughters, I've been thinking a lot about this, and they're of age, a 17-year-old and a 25-year-old. I have not been able to talk to them specifically about sexual violence in any detail. I've shared, the kind of work I'm doing. And I think that what I hope to teach them is when bad things like this happen, it's our obligation to stand up and speak and not be silent, whether it happens to somebody else or, one of our own. I have heard quite a bit about young people today. I think there's sort of two directions. One is a lot of young Jewish people are very concerned about what is going on in Gaza. And the other is that it is also energizing sort of a resurgence on college campuses, for example, of interest in Judaism and pride in Judaism. So it's sort of going both directions at the same time.
Thank you. Yeah, I think I can speak for everyone when I say we're certainly glad that the four of you are raising Israel's next offenders. But that's a good segue into our next question, which is, can you comment on your view of how the pro-Palestinian rallies on campuses should be handled? Assuming no violence, should it be allowed as free speech and met with more speech, or are the words themselves harassment?
Assuming there's no violence. Well, I want to think about this for a second.
Go for it. We'll come back to it.
The college campus presidents from Harvard, Penn, and MIT demonstrated the problem on college campuses. The problem is the uneven application of the principles of freedom of speech. So we hold dear the First Amendment right to freedom of speech on our campuses, but when it is applied unevenly, you end up with situations that we're seeing on college campuses all across the United States and around the world. And I think that the issue is not whether or not this is an issue of free speech, it's whether or not all student groups are allowed to speak freely, peacefully, and in the same manner, including with support from campus security when that's necessary or perceived to be necessary. That also holds true with speakers coming to campuses who are coming to speak up in favor of Israel. They should not be shouted down, and the administrations are wholly responsible for ensuring that freedom of speech thrives on campuses.
Just give my answer. No, I totally agree with Bonnie. It's not a question of free speech. It's a question of an even application of standards. So if they want to say, anybody can say what they want to say. That's the policy. That's wonderful. That is not actually what we have. We have a policy of fat phobia and don't misgender anybody, and that's harassment. And then you could say, call for the annihilation of Israel, and that's free speech. That's unacceptable. There should be one policy, and if it's gonna be fat phobia and don't misgender and all of that, then, I'm sorry, but calling for the annihilation of Israel and the Jews is also harassment. So double standard cannot exist.
I agree completely. I just wanted to add that, there's a debate also right now about where Jews belong in the DEI framework. And I think, we don't need to include ourselves in the DEI framework. We just need the rules to be applied to us fairly.
That's a great point. I want to move on to the next question, which is, should any repercussions from the Biden administration follow for international women or women's organizations like UN Women? And I think what this question might be alluding to is that UN Women has been funded for years to the tune of millions, maybe even billions, probably billions of dollars by the US government. And it's a separate UN entity, which means that our member dues do not go into UN Women. We're separately paying UN Women for, some would say, blood libel. But what can the administration do in this regard?
This is
We'll get
easy.
right on that.
Yeah, they'll get right on it. This is easy. The U.S. contribution to UN Women is what's called a voluntary contribution. The United States voluntarily contributes the lion's share, the plurality of funding to UN Women, also to other horrible UN agencies like UNRWA or the UN Human Rights Council. The United States can defund these horrible agencies, and in fact, it is not without precedent doing that. We regularly choose, always during a Republican administration, we always choose to defund organizations that are anathema to America's national security interests and America's moral compass. The perversion of UN Women, as demonstrated by its silence on October 7th, as demonstrated by public comments made by the president, who is a Jordanian national. These are all evidence for the case to defund UN Women, as we are not obligated under our UN membership to pay anything to them.
Elizabeth, did you want to say anything?
So we'll continue to call them out for their silence. And I think it's important that the UN as a whole also address this. Secretary General Guterres has spoken about it. He spoke about it in his opening remarks at a town hall at the Commission on the Status of Women. But their shift from silence to speaking about it, we have made a difference, right? We've through advocacy, through press reporting, we've made a difference. We've moved from silence to talking about it, at least. But now we have to move to providing justice to Israeli women and children, and to holding Hamas accountable. And not just to hold them accountable because they were the perpetrators, but frankly, for a broader purpose of deterring the use of sexual violence as a weapon of war in the future, so that no woman, regardless of what country she comes from, ever is the victim of sexual violence as a weapon of war.
Yeah, thank you. And it is worth noting that your organization and the work of the Civil Commission started in Israel just after the 7th. The UN's response in December was a direct result of your advocacy and of the media campaign you guys have started. So thank you very much. This will be our last question as well. But it seems that Ezra Klein's everything bagel liberalism or progressivism has corrupted our truth-making institutions. How do you break through a corrupted media? Good question there. If rape and war crimes cannot get through, how can anything else? Yeah.
Hire Eliana.
Truth teller Eliana. Let's hear it.
Well, I think we got to, it's a big question, but I think we got to part of that when we talked about discrediting organizations that claim to speak on behalf of women. And hard-hitting reporting is a part of that. Advocacy is another part of that. Congressional investigations are another part of that. And it takes a village, as a powerful feminist once said.
I think the everything bagel approach of to progressivism is a hilarious concept. I've never heard that before, so thank you. I think that having morals as a guide is fundamentally a good thing. And everything bagel is not a moral compass, it's a food. And having values that guide a system is something that we in the United States, we're lucky as a democracy to have that. Israel as a democracy is lucky to have that. I think that, you know, we have to keep at it. And you know, if we don't, it dies. And, or I guess the bagel analogy would mean it's toast. But at the end of the day, I think we're not everything to all people. We are a country guided by morals and a country that leads by morals and values. And it's the reason that people want to come to America. They're not lining up to get into Russia. They're not lining up to get into China, but they want the freedom that's guided by a moral infrastructure that America provides. And that's why all of us are here. At some point in time, our relatives said, we want something better. And it's not everything. It's not footloose and fancy free, but it's a structured moral community that we're all part of.
Just to add to that, Peter Berkowitz, who's the Director of Studies for the Public Interest Fellowship, writes a lot about this in Real Clear Politics, about how all of those principles have been entirely dismantled in academia. And one of the ways I think to actually address it is to fix that. And I leave that all to you.
Thanks for that. Thank you all very much. I invite you all to stay for the cocktail reception after, but for now, National Review Institute's Ashley McClay would like to say a few words. Thank you.
Thank you all for this enlightening panel this evening. One more round of applause for this was an incredibly important topic tonight, and I'm glad we were able to highlight Haley Strack's coverage and help end the silence on this particularly heavy issue. This is, as you all might know, Women's History Month, and while this might not be a joyous occasion, this is a topic that will go down into women's history. So I'm very glad that we gave a little bit of light to this issue. If you enjoyed this event tonight, next week, April 3rd, we will be partnering with the University of Arizona to host a debate on environmental, social, and governance, ESG, delving into the multifaceted nature of this issue. Those not in the Phoenix area can register to watch live from the comfort of their home. This debate, we will feature Kevin Hassett from National Review Institute. And also for those in the Washington, D.C. area, please save the date. We will be featuring the centennial of William F. Buckley's birth and his legacy in 2025 on March 19th through 22nd in Washington, D.C. We'll have our NRI Ideas Summit. So save the date. More information will be coming soon. And please be sure to sign up for updates at nrinstitute.org. That's nrinstitute.org. Thank you for those joining us in person, as well as those who are watching online and who have tuned into the live stream. This concludes our program this evening. I hope you will join us afterwards to continue the conversation. Thank you again.
And, how many plans?